let's head back to 2001 for the US launch of the Game Boy Advance, Nintendo's 6th generation handheld with a 32-bit processor and a CPU speed of 16.8 MHz. Truly, specs that will forever be immortalized and will never not be looked at as advanced. I'm joking, of course, but it was a huge leap from the previous Game Boy incarnations. As such, the launch titles would be interesting to say the least, to show the public just what this new system could do in comparison to its predecessors. Of course, games like Super Mario Advance, Rayman Advance, and Castlevania Circle of the Moon Advance are still remembered today to varying degrees and are interesting to observe in just how they all approached this objective. However, today, we're going to talk about a launch title for the system that has very much faded into obscurity. Introducing Iridion 3D, a pseudo 3D on-rails flight shooter. Now, something that a lot of Game Boy Advance games tried to do but rarely succeeded in was emulating or even creating a three-dimensional perspective. This resulted in a lot of games that were neat and exciting at the time. However, in the wake of systems like the Nintendo DS and PSP, in addition to subsequent handhelds such as the ones we have currently, these games really start to show their age. However, just because this was the case with a lot of Game Boy Advance games of its kin, is it really fair to assume that this game will be of the same quality? In fact, let's not assume any further. Let's just play the game already and see for ourselves. I am speechless. Honestly, seeing a game this graphically impressive for the system running considerably smoother than a standard GBA game with very little pixelation as objects get closer to the screen while playing it on an actual GBA is one of the most surreal things that I have seen in a while. Already, this is a huge technical achievement. However, what else would you expect from Shin'en Multimedia? But even knowing that this is Shin'en doing their thing, this is still quite something to behold. However, if there's any aspect of this game that can surpass the graphics by a mile, it's this game's soundtrack. This is easily my favorite soundtrack to come from the system. No joke, after picking this game up earlier this year, I have on numerous occasions opened the sound test, plugged in my earphones, and just listened to the soundtrack while on walks. Who needs a fancy iPod when you could just listen to your Game Boy instead? With all that out of the way, how would I describe the music? Well, it is very, very Amiga. Seriously, if you like the kind of electronic music present on that thing, whether it be calming, intense, or somewhere in between, I highly recommend this soundtrack, and the same goes for the other way around. In fact, when looking up the soundtrack on YouTube, because of course I would, I found a lot of people comparing the soundtrack to those of the Turrican games. Now, on average, it tends to remind me more of some of Chris Wilsbeck's other works, like the music in Epidia. But yes, when it sounds like Turrican, it really sounds like Turrican. I guess it's only fitting that composer Manfred Linzner was signed on to do the music for a cancelled Turrican game on the Game Boy Color. But regardless of the similar style, it is so good on its own that the novelty of, hey, this sounds like Wilsbeck, is just that, a novelty. So, awesome graphics, performance, and music aside, how does the game actually hold up? Well, to start, the controls are very good. Your ship can move around the screen very quickly, but you always feel like you're in complete control over the movement. The button mapping makes sense, and you're even given the option for inverted Y-axis for flight game veterans, and non-inverted for those less familiar with the genre. Then there's the game design. Now, the primary means of interaction in these kinds of flight games are to dodge and shoot. So, when trying to make an engaging game of this genre, you generally want to provide the player with as much stimuli as possible. You really don't want to leave the player just hanging there with nothing happening for long, and technical limitations can play a big part in making this an issue. Hell, Star Fox 64 had issues with this. However, this is an area where the game actually does a surprisingly good job. In fact, this game can be pretty tough, even from the beginning, but again, seeing how this is Shin'en, that should surprise absolutely nobody. While the enemy and hazard placement is logical and reasonable, power-ups for health and weapon upgrades are generally very scarce. Also, seeing how every time you die, your weapon downgrades to the previous setting until you are back to square one again, a lot of the challenge comes from not only leveling up your projectile of choice as much as humanly possible, but also preserving that status. While it's not impossible to destroy enemies in the weakest state, it becomes a better idea to start evading enemies and incoming fire rather than confront it. However, it's not like the game is without its issues either. While the game works very well in enclosed areas like tunnels and some moderately roomy areas such as above sea, lava, and the clouds, but in space, it has trouble coping. In the Moon Assault level, there is so much space that it honestly becomes hard to make sense of things. Like here, I'm flying for this power-up, but I'm taking damage and I legitimately don't know what's hitting me. Because of this, I often avoid shooting enemies and collecting power-ups in this level, and spend my time pretty much evading everything instead. Thankfully, this is the only level in the game where I really had an issue with this. And some of the boss fights can be a little sporadic in difficulty. Like, the first level boss is one of the hardest in the whole game, and the second boss, while still a decent challenge, is a lot easier. However, this is not to the point where the last boss is upstaged by an earlier boss. Oh no, beating Mainframe is quite the challenge. So much so that I've never done so at all. Yep, this is one of those games where you keep playing the game, getting better and better, and then the final boss is so difficult you suddenly feel like you're a baby trying to orchestrate a rocket launch. One day, Mainframe, I will beat you. Until then, I'll continuously die by your very figurative hands. But in the end, Iridion 3D is very good for what it is. It's a technical achievement released in a handheld's infancy with very little else rivaling it in that regard, even to the end of the GBA's lifespan. Not only that, but it isn't just an overglorified tech demo. There's a very solid game here that, by all means, shouldn't even be able to run on this hardware. I was able to snag this game for only a couple of dollars, if even that, and I'd say it's a rather overlooked as well as underrated title. The Game Boy Advance's library has a lot, and I mean a lot of trash in it, and I'd definitely say that this is a diamond in the rough.